The museum here means a great deal to me. Mauthausen is a concentration camp that has remained in good condition. It presents an image of what it was like during the war. When you arrive at the roll area, looking right and left, one can get an impression. That's Mauthausen.
Mauthausen Memorial, a former concentration camp. For 7 years, this site witnessed horrific human suffering that ultimately claimed more than 90,000 lives. On the 5th of May 1945, the concentration camp is liberated by Allied troops. 4 years later, the grounds are opened as a memorial, which today draws 200,000 visitors every year. It is a site with a variety of functions, but decades have passed without the completion of necessary renovation and modernization work. There has been no shortage of concepts and plans for the site, but none have been realized. The latest proposed redesign is intended to change this. The project's aims are to maintain the site's relevance for future generations and to push it back into the focus of academic discourse. Moreover, the memorial must take on a new role and purpose.
This site is undergoing its most significant change since the concentration camp was liberated and the memorial was opened after the war. For decades, we have been working with the exhibition without a well-thought-out program for how to present its contents to visitors. For the first time since the beginning of this redesign project in 2008, significant steps are now being planned and realized.
To begin with, concentration camp memorials were marginalized places, neither particularly important for Austria nor accepted by Austrian society. They were only relevant for survivors and the families of former inmates as a place of commemoration. However, their relevance in Austria's culture of remembrance has been growing over time. I believe that this camp has now become a central site of remembrance of the crimes committed by the National Socialist regime. The site of a former concentration camp represents different things to different groups. For former inmates and their associations, they are symbolic sites, places of suffering. For third and fourth generation relatives and families of those held here from around the world, these sites are places where they can gather, as often the graves of their ancestors are located here. They are political sites. Mauthausen in particular is home to many memorials. Today they are also centers of learning. But above all, this is a site that witnessed crimes on an international scale.
On the 3rd of May 1970, the first permanent exhibition in the infirmary building is opened. With the exception of one design revision in 1982, it will remain unchanged for 42 years. The Mauthausen Museum is established under the direction of Hans Marschalek, a former inmate. In 1942, the trained typesetter is arrested by the Gestapo and later sent to Mauthausen. After his liberation, he becomes a driving force behind ensuring that the history of the concentration camp is understood, and his work leaves a lasting mark on the memorial.
The outgoing exhibition had been on display for decades and it was showing its age. The approach taken with this exhibition can also be seen at other sites, including those in Germany. The term museum has largely been avoided. In general, exhibitions in former concentration camps were documentations of the past, meaning they had a subdued formal language, a subdued aesthetic, and used large pictures. It was as if one had to prove that all of this actually did take place here. Today, 70 years after the Allies revealed these crimes to the world, we are in a completely different place.
Aufdecken der Verbrechen durch die Alliierten wo ganz woanders.
The museum was designed to make an impression on young Austrians, Austrian students, and the Austrian population, but not on foreigners. Mauthausen was a camp for foreign inmates. But generally speaking, most Austrians did not want to know anything about this period. It is important to remember that many teachers, Austrians, were members of the German Wehrmacht. Even though they did not commit any crimes themselves, they still did not want to see or hear about the crimes of the National Socialist regime. Of course, these teachers rarely spoke of the barbarity of National Socialism with their pupils until around the 1960s. This approach was influenced by concern that if the history of such camps was not illustrated so dramatically and with bold black and white pictures, younger visitors would simply not understand. That was the approach taken back then. There was a clear divide, with the victims on one side and the perpetrators on the other. The perpetrators were predominantly Germans, not Austrians, and the inmates were a united group. Thanks to research conducted since then, we know that it was not as simple as that. We are attempting to give these simple pictures from the former exhibition another layer of complexity, without overlooking visitors who are less familiar with the subject material.
Walking through this exhibition that was opened in 1970, it no longer presents the status quo in terms of the pedagogical and scientific requirements. So I asked why the exhibition was still in place. The answer was that it had been put together by a survivor, and therefore it could not be changed. This survivor, Hans Marschalek, had been responsible for it and the memorial for a long time. He had built up the archive. He had designed the exhibition himself. We went out for a coffee together, and I thought about how I could explain to him that we had new ideas. Then I plucked up the courage to tell him that I would like to open a new exhibition. His eyes lit up and he said, "Thank God that I will be able to see it come to an end."
For more than 20 years, researchers and interest groups call for new ideas for the site. Following the first renovation initiative in the early 2000s, it's not until 2007 that the Austrian Ministry of the Interior agrees on the details of the site's redesign. Those responsible for the project faced a great challenge, starting with revising the visitor orientation in the areas of the crematorium, execution site, and gas chamber. In addition, 2 new permanent exhibitions will be installed in the former infirmary building. In order to focus and work on the implementation efficiently, the core team is limited to 13 people. Over the following years, however, well over 100 people are involved in the project.
At the beginning, it was clear to me and my team that we needed support, so we began collaborating with experts and survivors from the very start. We have brought in the expertise of directors of other memorials. We are working on research projects with survivor organizations that, in some cases, obviously have more experience in this field than we do. We really are focusing on collaboration and drawing on existing expertise.
Despite the difficulties presented by the subject, I still view it as a very creative process. Irrespective of whether one is a designer, building historian, a monument conservator, historian, or cultural scientist, one must engage oneself in a very intense discussion.
The new exhibitions play an important role. For some visitors, their time at the memorial will be one of only a few moments in their lives when they are confronted with National Socialism. In addition, the experts must deal with the fact that the number of witnesses to events at the camp who can retell its history firsthand is becoming smaller as time goes on. It is an issue that engages the employees also on a personal level.
My grandfather was able to tell me about it, and I can tell my children about it with the help of this kind of exhibition. This certainly gives me the motivation to be involved in this project and deal with this topic. And it is important to remember that most of the youngsters in Upper Austria and across the country will probably see this exhibition as part of a school trip. The better the exhibition works, the better they will understand the topic. What concerns me the most is how the relevance of this site can be maintained in the future. For memorials which commemorate events that took place many years ago have a duty to explain what happened and illustrate through exhibitions why these events continue to be relevant.
We are conscious of the fact that it is the eyewitnesses who have kept the work of commemoration going over the last few decades. Now we are responsible for ensuring that this period is never forgotten, and above all, that this knowledge is passed on to future generations.
One of the first tasks of the redesign is the restoration of the infirmary building. The questions raised by this element reflect the key issues surrounding the project as a whole. How does one approach working on historical structures? How does one deal with a variety of roles of the site? A cemetery, a monument, a memorial, and an educational institution. How does one engage a broad demographic of visitors? What is the principal duty of a contemporary exhibition?
As a young Austrian in the 1980s, the insistence that Austria was the first victim of National Socialism really bothered me. One must bear in mind that in the early years, the camp was presented as if it were a German concentration camp on Austrian soil that had nothing to do with Austria. Therefore, the heavy responsibility that Austria bears for this camp is, for me, at the heart of making these changes, politically and also as a motivating factor.
It is a question of what we want from this site in the future. What does this site have to say almost 70 years after the liberation of prisoners who suffered tremendously here? What do we want to communicate 70 years on from the liberation, and what is our mission? These are complex questions for which we do not yet have all the answers. And then we have to consider whether there is just one solution, one single answer for how it can be dealt with.
The first few times I came back from the redesign meetings, I was even more confused than before. In my head, I began with sealing off all the many places and buildings here at the camp, taking the stance that not everything had to be on show. I believed that too much had already been displayed. I first needed to form some kind of structure in my mind and focus on what the most important aspect of this site is. We are now trying to create an exhibition that represents the broad spectrum of people from across Europe who were here in the camp and lessen this fixation on Austria. We also want to take a more critical look at the involvement of Austrian society in National Socialism. Essentially, it is about telling the story in such a way that younger generations who have no connection to National Socialism can become more familiar with this period in history, and interest in this topic can be stimulated.
The former infirmary building is the focus of the first redesign phase. Having previously been home to the Hans Marschalek exhibition, it will soon house two new permanent exhibitions. The original function of the building was to provide care for a few particularly privileged inmates, but the camp was liberated before it could be completed.
We have approached the building structures with respect, taking minimal action. The archaeological renovation has been conducted in a way that ensures that the work can be seen clearly. We have made the old wall structures visible, and we are attempting to adapt to the structures as much as possible in order to avoid any further changes to the building. Working in the infirmary building in Mauthausen poses a particular challenge. Firstly, because it is a historic building, and secondly, it is listed, meaning that certain works on the structure of the building simply cannot be carried out. The aim of our design is to use transparency to maintain an experience of the historic building beyond the exhibition.
Many long-term research projects are being carried out as part of the redesign. Among them are archaeological studies and excavations, such as the tent camp, the infirmary camp, the execution site, and the ash dump, a hollow in which the human remains from the crematorium were disposed of. The team hopes to find new exhibits by emptying a lake near the quarry. In 2000, during the preparations for a memorial concert, a steel cable is dismantled and falls into the water. As the cable is pulled out, it brings with it the chassis of a wagon. The fire brigade has now pumped all of the water out of the lake, revealing many more objects of historical interest.
The archaeological excavations were very important, not only in terms of discovering more about the general history of the Mauthausen concentration camp, but also in terms of selecting the artifacts for the exhibition.
Two different contexts must be considered here. However, they both reflect the final days of the war very well. On the one hand, these objects were still being used while the quarry was in operation, and the inmates were still being forced to work here. On the other hand, these relics are like witnesses. One could simply get rid of the things into the ponds, which could essentially be used as refuse dumps. We have been carrying out archaeological studies here at the memorial for 4 years. This is not the first investigation we have conducted here. Basically, one can say that archaeological sources, the relics here under the soil, have a very high significance that is not intrinsic to written sources, pictures, or photographs. We have an additional source of evidence from which we can learn more about the National Socialist era.
Only items that are of interest for the exhibition are retrieved. Everything else is painstakingly documented and left in the lake, which fills back up with water once the pumps are turned off, thus recreating a setting that has preserved artifacts that remain silent witnesses of the horrendous events that took place here. After the Anschluss of Austria to National Socialist Germany, work on establishing a camp in Mauthausen commences in order to create additional detention areas for political opponents and the socially undesirable. In 1938, the camp holds around 1,000 predominantly German and Austrian prisoners. By March 1945, more than 84,000 inmates from many nations are detained in Mauthausen and the other satellite camps across the country.
There were around 1,000 people on the train. We didn't know where we were going. Some died in our wagon during the journey to the camp. It was unbearably hot, and the conditions were terrible. There was no toilet. The wagons were built for transporting livestock. We carried the dead up from the train station. 3 died in our wagon. We carried their bodies up the hill to Mauthausen.
So why was Mauthausen chosen as the site? Granite quarries are located in the region, and granite is the construction material of choice for the megalomaniacal plans of the Third Reich.
We were sent to the Wiener Graben quarry. This assignment was the worst. There were around 1,200 of us. We were forced to carry the stones. Only a barbed wire fence marked the perimeter of the site. The stones carried up to the camp were used to construct the camp wall. It is terrible to recall. We had to carry the stones ourselves. Some inmates were older, so they were given bigger stones. They would take a few steps and then fall to the ground, with the stone crashing down on their head. They beat us as we climbed the steps. 186 steps, 12 or even 15 times a day. Just imagine it. They drove us on like cattle. There were always bodies on the steps.
The concentration camp was operated as a Grade 3 site, which meant that inmates faced the toughest conditions, a fight for survival, characterized by inhumane labor, constant hunger, mistreatment, punishment, and disease.
We were working 12 hours a day, continuously working. Conditions were bad, and where the camp was infested with lice. I mean, infested with lice. They were crawling all over the person. There was no way of getting rid of them. And this was another thing. And from that lack of vitamins in the food, people develop all kind of how you call it, wounds, which never healed. I had two of those. I had one here at the bottom of the foot. It was a hole about size of a half a dollar, all the way to the bone.
The worst thing of all was that we were desperately thirsty, particularly those who had typhus and fever. There was barely anything to drink. About half a meter beyond the fence was a little stream. It was awful. It was difficult to resist walking towards it. One wretched soul made his way over to the fence. While the German guard was talking to me, he coldly shot the man dead. At the same time, he was saying that it would only be a few more days. That was his job. It was terrible. It had a deep psychological effect on me.
The camp size increases every year. Some of the inmates are forced to work continuously on the expansion. Mauthausen also becomes increasingly important in relation to armaments. From 1943, granite is no longer a priority, for the Third Reich need weapons. Many of the inmates are forced into labor for the armaments industry. Some attempt to put up resistance by means of sabotage.
There were ways of mounting resistance, but one had to be careful. Only a few had the chance to do so. When manufacturing the rivets, which contained very little bauxite anyway, we were able to overheat them. As a result, the rivets were not sturdy enough to be fit for purpose. This was undetectable when the rivets were checked. How else were we able to mount resistance? We could also remove the cable insulation in aircraft, which would eventually result in a short circuit.
The methods of execution are not limited to poison gas and shooting. Torture, mistreatment, and pure willful neglect also result in death. It is a system that even leads to inmates turning on each other, and at Mauthausen alone, results in the death of more than 90,000 inmates. It is important to remember that the Mauthausen concentration camp and Gusenbranch camp are part of a vast network that spans the length and breadth of Austria, comprising more than 40 satellite camps. For those liberated in 1945, the story of their persecution is far from over. Many have lost family and friends who did not survive the National Socialist regime. They no longer have a place that they can call home.
There were 360 Roma and 19 returned home. They had a place to go where they could live. But now no one is left. Hitler cleaned them out, just like a farmer cleans out a stable.
Whether or not the educational concept of the exhibition will be well received by the visitors depends on many factors. How does one engage young people who have no contact with contemporary witnesses? How does one establish contemporary references in order to demonstrate the relevance of Mauthausen today? How can complex issues be conveyed to visitors who have varying degrees of knowledge of the subject matter?
In this exhibition, we really focus on working with the information left behind by witnesses in interviews. In one section of the exhibition, there are interviews on practically every topic presented there. In each case, this provides us with a subjective perspective, but at the same time, it can also cover an aspect of the topic in question very well. They simply must be used, for there is nothing more immediate than an interview with an eyewitness.
Weil es gibt nichts Unmittelbares als ein Zeitzeugeninterview.
There is no point in trying to create an exhibition that enables visitors to somehow relive this period of history and feel that they can experience what happened 70 or 80 years ago. It is simply impossible. We do not want to overwhelm visitors with the subject matter, but instead present the facts and allow room for emotion without exploiting it.
Today, the Mauthausen Memorial is the most important memorial for the victims of National Socialism in Austria. It is a historical site, but one whose history did not end in 1945. Shortly before the camp's liberation, the SS are able to destroy significant amounts of evidence. After the liberation, inmates take items as evidence of the crimes committed there. To prevent the potential outbreak of an epidemic, the Allies immediately burned down the infirmary camp. The Soviet army, as well as local people, removed further items from the former concentration camp. On the 20th of June 1947, the grounds are handed over by the Soviet occupation force to the Austrian Republic, subject to the condition that the site is preserved as a memorial. 1 year later, as part of the transformation of the site, further structures, including almost all of the barracks, are torn down. The walls, towers, and commandant's offices remain intact, as do the quarry below the camp and the stairs of death that lead to it. Still standing around the roll call area are the infirmary building, camp prison, kitchen barracks, laundry, and 3 prisoners' barracks. In 1949, as part of further changes made to the site, a sarcophagus bearing the inscription, "May the living learn from the fate of the dead," is erected. In addition, cemeteries are created on the grounds of the site for inmates who died shortly before and after the liberation of the camp. Space in the former laundry is dedicated to a chapel and secular votive room. At the end of 1949, France becomes the first country to erect a national monument at the site. It is the first of 21 in a dedicated monument park. In 2003, the Mauthausen Memorial witnesses its last major change until now. A new visitor center is built. The memorial has never been, and will never be, a place where time stands still. The new general exhibition and the crime scenes of Mauthausen, Searching for Traces exhibition, are now being installed in the former infirmary building. More than 100 original objects will go on display to bring the story of the camp closer to visitors. Loans from museums and private individuals, as well as artifacts found on the site, will be exhibited.
In particular, the artifacts that belong to the inmates lend their history a more personal dimension. One can learn about the fate of an inmate and hopefully identify in some way with what he or she experienced.
We found items that the inmates had to hand over upon arrival at the camp. These objects are now displayed in a cabinet, and when viewing them for the first time, you wonder why they are on display. A ring, a watch, some photos of old women with babies. But these items can actually be used to tell the story of how a regular person gradually became an inmate and lost their personal possessions. And we know that mostly fathers came here and had to give up what was dearest to all of them, the memory of their families.
Tatsächlich ihr Wertvollstes da auch abgeben mussten, nämlich also die Erinnerungen an die Familie.
One small object of great symbolic significance is this needle. It was used for injecting poisonous substances. When the needle became damaged, an inmate was ordered to take it for repair. Instead, he smuggled it out of the camp. During the preliminary stages of the Dachau Mauthausen trials in 1946, the needle was handed over, only to be rejected as a piece of evidence. The period after the camp's liberation is also documented in the exhibition. A bicycle symbolizes the theme of returning home. As soon as he's freed, Stanislav Kudlinski wants to get home as quickly as possible. He and two fellow survivors are given this bicycle by nuns in Linz. With this and a second bicycle, they complete the long journey back to Poland. Kudlinski kept possession of the bicycle until his death. It is now returned, on loan from his family.
If, after all of the work we have done on the exhibition, I walk away knowing only who Stanislav Kudlinski was and about how he rode home on his bicycle, or one of the other stories, then I will know that we have taken exactly the right approach. We have exhibited many archaeological findings, and they are among the most meaningful objects we could display, for many of them are all that remain of the inmates. Like this button from a Russian uniform, for example, which is the only remaining trace of the Soviet prisoners of war who were killed on a huge scale here at the camp. There are no other exhibits for these prisoners. We found this button and therefore included it in the exhibition.
This sign also has a story and a message. Animosity towards minorities such as Sinti and Romanis remains a social problem even after 1945. In 1995, 50 years after the liberation of Michael Horvath from Mauthausen, two of his grandchildren are victims of the mail bomber Franz Fuchs. Both lose their lives in attempting to remove the sign bearing the racist message.
Ja, lite av vad till bombnamnsordning.
Of the 4 killed in the bomb attack, 2 were my grandchildren.
2 Enkelkinder von mir.
Kali and Erwin. I don't think that anyone who works at a concentration camp memorial questions why they do what they do. Every day one realizes that the work one is doing is meaningful. One also needs some professional distance from the topic, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to do such a job. One could think about the story behind every single spoon. But sometimes this is a good thing, for it makes one even more motivated. When one has worked for many years in an archive dedicated to documenting the crimes of the National Socialist regime, to some degree this work becomes routine. It is important to me to have contact with survivors, whose numbers are unfortunately decreasing, or their families. This personal contact makes one appreciate the real significance of this administrative work. It allows one to look beyond the confines of the institution and see the wider context.
Ich kann mir thematisch keine schwierigere Arbeit vorstellen.
In the field of exhibition design, I cannot image a more challenging topic. For every element can be significant as well as unsuitable.
Das kann mit Farben beginnen, die sehr gut
For example, the colors which must be carefully selected and applied, and the font of the texts.
Wo man Fehler machen kann. Das macht an und für sich generell sehr schwierig.
There are so many ways one can get it wrong, and this makes it very difficult. One doesn't want to trigger a debate that focuses on the design of the exhibition and ignores the content.
Nicht über Inhalte zu sprechen, sondern über schlechte Form zu sprechen.
5th of May 2013, the day of the reopening. The President of Austria and members of the government sit alongside the heads of state from Poland and Hungary and representatives from Russia, Serbia, Germany, the USA and Israel. Most importantly, 30 contemporary witnesses are also present. Many have brought with them mementos from their time in the concentration camp, which are placed into a time capsule, a gesture to help ensure that we never forget. Anna Berger-Moran is one of them. She was born in a concentration camp in 1945 and was transferred with her mother to Mauthausen. She lays her birth certificate, issued following the liberation of the camp, in the time capsule as a memento.
I think it should be known that there were babies, and it should be known what strength there was among the prisoners, that the women who were in the same barrack with my mother tore off their own clothes and made me that shirt and that little hat. My mother never talked much about the experience because she was looking to be after the war and have a child. And that was the goal, to survive. She was in the camp for 7 months of her pregnancy, and that was driving her to survive. She wanted to come back home. And I think that's all I can talk about. It was horrible, and we survived it.
The first time I came over here was in 1959, the first time after the war, 1959. The camp was as it was when we left. All the blocks were still on. You know what? The thing that came to my mind was the smell. The smell came to my, maybe it was only the mind that worked that way, like, not the smell of the crematorium, because that everybody knows, it smells like burning a pair of leather boots. That's the smell, leather. The smell of death, of the body decomposing, you don't smell it, you taste it. You can feel it on your tongue almost.
I can tell that the visitors to the camp cannot comprehend what happened back then. They simply cannot believe it. For them, it is a tale, not a true story. No one can comprehend that people were persecuted so terribly.
A personal friend is asking me, why you come here every year for these places? Why you making yourself so bad as you just suffering? And my answer, so you have any relative or parents is in a cemetery? Yes. I says, so someday you decide you want to take some flower or a juice taking some piece of stone, you could go to the cemetery. I said, when I came to any of these camps, Mauthausen, in Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Melk, Ebensee, are coming to my cemeteries. And these people maybe don't have anybody, but I want to remember them. That's the reason I come.
At the end of the ceremony, Austrian President Dr. Heinz Fischer carries the time capsule to its place in the entrance area of the infirmary building, in front of the exhibitions. With this act, the newly renovated Mauthausen Museum is officially opened.
The most emotional moment has undoubtedly been meeting so many survivors here today, and above all, those with whom I have now shared a connection for such a long time. A connection because we contacted them to record their stories. A connection because we found items that we wanted to exhibit that once belonged to them. A connection because I have now known them for so long and we have developed true friendships. The effort that they have made to travel here to attend this ceremony and celebrate this day with me, my team, and the next generation. This has been the most moving and emotional moment.
Before attending the ceremony, the survivors had an opportunity to visit the new exhibitions. In an exhibition area spanning 1,500 square meters, visitors can watch interviews with eyewitnesses and look at historical objects and learn the stories behind them. The new concept, named Victims and Perpetrators, attempts to present complex relationships in a manner that is comprehensible to every visitor.
The general exhibition is set out in chronological order, beginning with the construction of the camp, including some background information, and ending with its liberation. Preceding this section on the history of the camp is a prologue dedicated to the period following the camp's liberation, the Second Republic, about the survivors and also the perpetrators. It was crucial for us to show that the camp was not an isolated institution, but instead part of a European-wide network of terror constructed by the National Socialists that comprised many camps. Just like the victims who were transported from one camp to the next, so too the perpetrators moved around this network. We also wanted to show what bearing the decisions made by the inmates had on the conditions they were forced to live in. That means that we have an entire thread that tells the story not from the view of the perpetrators, but instead exclusively from the perspective of the victims, illustrating how the inmates' decision affected how they survived in the camp. Essentially, the permanent exhibition is there to provide greater depth to the historical information that visitors will have taken in while walking around the rest of the memorial site. It is also important to illustrate how this camp has changed and developed over the years. Mauthausen was not the same in 1938 as it was in 1943 or 1945. These are the main features of our exhibition. The role of the crime scenes exhibition is to inform visitors how murder was carried out in Mauthausen. On the one hand, it is a forensic exhibition, which clearly depicts what happened here and how one can interpret the traces left behind. On the other hand, the exhibition also looks at the site from a post-war perspective, considering how these traces were dealt with and why Mauthausen looks the way it does today. In my opinion, one must make it clear that inmates were killed and murdered right across the site at Mauthausen, in the gas chamber, in the quarry and on the campgrounds. Murder and death as a result of willful neglect and starvation were a part of daily life. This means that many more people were involved in this killing and death.
Das bedeutet wiederum auch, dass wesentlich mehr Menschen auf
It was not only those who operated the gas chambers, but also conceivably those who ran the administration of the camp.
sondern es waren Menschen,
These people were ultimately responsible for creating an environment in which death and killing were daily occurrences. It was important for us to highlight this.
This exhibition should function as a cognitive link. That means that the visitors must face this topic, and in doing so, they will be prepared for what they are about to see. The rooms beyond this point, the former killing area and crematoria, must remain a place of remembrance for all visitors, especially family members.
Until now, a visit to the memorial focused on the gas chamber. When it was designed, the memorial was laid out so that a visit ended at the gas chamber. We felt that it was important to put the prominence of the gas chamber into perspective, integrate it as part of the entire Mauthausen concentration camp complex, and make this clear to visitors.
Not only was the gas chamber accessible from two sides, but visitors were also able to walk through it. This, of course, often led to congestion on busy days, with many people in the gas chamber at once. This was an extremely inappropriate situation. Moreover, from our archaeological investigations and collaboration with the Federal Monuments Office, we know that this led to significant wear to the historical structure. Beyond that, when considering its role from an educational perspective, we also questioned whether it was necessary for a visitor to actually stand inside the gas chamber.
The new pathway prevents visitors from entering the gas chamber and also leads them to the Room of Names. One of the numerous projects carried out as part of the renovation was research, in collaboration with 36 nations, of the names of more than 81,000 victims of the Mauthausen concentration camp. The research was conducted with the acknowledgement that it would be impossible to name every single person.
In this room are displayed the names of all the inmates known to have died in the camp. The inmates are not listed in any particular order, and they are there for visitors to take a moment for remembrance.
The idea of the Room of Names is to give people back their identity, and above all, to give family members, as well as visitors, the chance to reflect on what happened here. Additionally, there is the possibility of looking up the names in a book, which includes the dates and places of birth and the dates of death. This enables visitors to identify with the victims to an even greater degree.
With the completion of the first phase of the renovation, the memorial is once again home to the contemporary museum that takes on the challenge of bridging the ever-increasing gulf of time since the closure of the camp, explaining the relevance of its history to new generations.
With the completion of both of the new exhibitions and the commemorative room, we have undeniably reached a milestone. However, the work goes on. We are continuously thinking about how we can convey to our younger visitors the suffering and atrocities that took place here to ensure that it is never repeated. This memorial should act as a reminder to us all never to stray from the path of democracy. Looking at our overall concept from 2009, we have a program for the next 10 to 15 years. We proposed a kind of decentralized exhibition concept, which means presenting information about an event precisely where it happened. For example, an exhibition dedicated to the inmate society, an exhibition on the SS guards, and an exhibition on the topic of forced labor, as well as how the memorial has been received over the years. The other large component is the site's open-air areas.
We plan to make the historical boundaries of the camp visible and clearly mark out the areas of the site that were of significant historical importance. For example, the infirmary camp, where most of the inmates died, is a field today, and it is therefore barely recognizable for visitors who are unfamiliar with the camp's layout.
Ich glaube, dieses Objekt hat eine Zukunft.
I believe that this site has a future. Mauthausen is known around the world. And I believe that the International Mauthausen Committee will always take pride in performing its role, maintaining this memorial and the museum.